With super heavy walkers stomping much of Warhammer 40k flat at the moment, let's talk about some tactics for countering and beating the Imperial and Chaos Knights. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about the power of the Imperial and Chaos Knights in game, and with quite such a lot of crazy intimidating power at the moment, talk about options for those facing them from the other side of the tabletop. As has been a really big area of discussion in Warhammer 40k recently, the Imperial and Chaos Knights have been doing very well in game. They're just very strong and pretty easy to use. An entire army worth of big stat lines and big guns is generally tricky to beat at a casual level. You almost always tend to be a bit stronger there versus at the top tier of the competitive games, though it seems that at the moment they're absolutely both, with big points cuts to Titanic Knights both for the Imperials and Chaos, basically propelling both of those armies to be some of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k. It's kind of early days since the changes went into effect, but it looks like Imperial Knights have around about 57 to 60% wins depending on if you're looking competitive or casual, and the Chaos Knights are somewhere between 52 and 60, either way far above most factions in the game. And it also looks like they're taking more than their fair share at the tops of tournaments over the past few weeks, having a whole load of event wins and 5-0 undefeated runs. By every metric, both at competitive and casual play, they can be a challenge to overcome. While it does clearly show that they're a very strong army in game, I still keep the tournament and casual stats in some kind of proportion. They're obviously stronger than most, and most players playing Knights will probably have an easier time winning with them than the average faction in Warhammer 40k right now. But that absolutely doesn't mean that they win every game. Even if we round up a little bit and say that they're winning 60% of games, it means that an average player is still losing 4 out of 10 games. They are beatable even if they are stacking the odds in their favour. Certain armies just probably aren't really at a big disadvantage against them. Things like Thousand Sons and Death Guard also looking kind of obscenely powerful. Similar sort of numbers on the competitive scene. Loads of armies in 40k in the sort of mid-tier can absolutely get good victories against them, though I will admit that some armies will struggle. There are some factions in the game that are just a bit underpowered at the moment, and any armies that are going to struggle to kill toughness 11 vehicles will have trouble. Maybe Tyranids and Grey Knights being good examples of that. Maybe struggling to deal with the big stat check that is Imperial and Chaos Knights more than most. In any case though, for this one I thought we'd round up a whole bunch of things that could be used to try and gain advantages over Knights, both in terms of understanding the foe, list construction, a bit of gameplay, and a few peripheral options around organising games. Firstly, just in general in Warhammer 40k, if you want to make the game fairer for most players, typically Games Workshop do tend to have things balanced around fairly heavy levels of terrain on the board. That certainly garners some issues and criticisms of its own, maybe being not quite so flexible, but probably one of the first things to check if you are playing against Knights casually. They're already an army that I consider somewhat unbalanced. If you decide to play against them in a really big open map without much terrain on it, then you're very likely going to be handing them yet another enormous advantage that they really don't need. If playing against Knights, I'd certainly make sure there's a fair amount of line of sight blocking terrain, plenty of ruins on the board. Games Workshop have some example tournament layouts. You don't necessarily need to copy one for one or anything, but maybe give a good idea as to the rough sort of levels of terrain that you might expect to have. Knights generally tend to do better on maps with low terrain, just due to being an army with enormous amounts of direct damage and defense. Particularly at the moment with their cheap stat lines, they're quite likely to win a direct damage contest against things, but big monster and vehicle profiles don't generally do so well if they have to be moving around ruins and not interacting with them quite as well as, say, infantry models do. You're likely going to have a lot more chance to get the jump on them and make sure that you get the first strike rather than them, and it can limit their movement as well, certainly for armigers and war dogs, and even with their better terrain interaction rules, Titanic Knights are going to find it far harder to get where they need to be, and more at risk of being screened or move blocked if there's more narrow movement lanes and more ruins. Just due to the sheer size and bulk of the models, Knights also tend to be armies that even on fairly heavy terrain setups they might struggle to hide everything. Armies with a smaller footprint might be able to hide everything out of line of sight turn 1, whereas Knights you might still have targets to shoot even if you happen to go first. For playing the whole movement game against Knights, for the Titanic ones that you encounter, they're going to be able to move through and over enemy models and terrain pieces of any height, though if they move through one that's greater than 4 inches in height, then they have to roll a d6 and on a 1 they're battle shocked, which will usually do nothing, but when it takes effect it could be kind of big, stopping them using key stratagems or doing secondary objectives or contesting the primary. If they do make use of that rule and move through tall terrain pieces, just need to make sure that they're rolling for that. For the super heavy walker rules, I'd also bear in mind that that doesn't apply when they're charging, so you can't use their smash through terrain things there. There needs to be walking around the outside of ruins, and again one to watch to make sure that's not being misplayed. Even with being able to move through and over enemy units though, it's often still possible to screen and limit the movement of big Knights. Knights have really got big enormous clunky bases, and if they want to move past one of your units, they need to move all the way over it, and then have enough space to get the back of their base greater than 1 inch clear than your unit on the board, and that often might not be possible. Even for their sideways measurements, a Knight base is 4 inches wide. So basically that means that if you have a unit that's parked just over 5 inches away from the knight, if it moves 10 inches, there's going to be no place that it can safely land behind it, as it needs to get 1 inch clear. So say for example, a bunch of Orc Gretchen here could stop the knight moving forward very far at all. If they deploy it just the right annoying sort of length away from the knight, you might force the big Questoris knights to move no more than 4 inches towards them, maybe charge them and destroy them in the fight phase, but you certainly could slow down the movement in quite a big way. These Savastus knights, lancers, and rampagers and gallants all move a bit faster, but even so, if you want to hold up and delay them, it's still at least somewhat possible, and particularly so if you've got a unit with a bunch of bodies, so you might be able to spread out a little bit, maybe going in 2 ranks so there's no room to land behind you, but you can also put models even closer to the knights to limit its movement in front of you. This one perhaps could be particularly interesting with infiltrators versus Imperial knights in particular, given that they don't tend to have infiltrators of their own, besides maybe if they're throwing an assassin far forward. If the knights get second turn, then you could make it so they're really not moving far into the midfield, potentially having trouble getting onto the primary objectives. And when terrain's countered as well, this could be even more painful for armigers or war dogs. Otherwise, it's at least fairly easy to use terrain to advantage to make the knights have a tougher time to get to you. It's kind of basics against any things that can't move through ruin walls, but if you stage your unit so they're just a bit greater than 1 inch away from the ruins, then it means that you won't be able to be charged from outside of them. Say for example, if this Votann guy was right up against the ruin wall, you might have engagement range enough so that you can charge them from just outside. And that could easily be the difference between losing entire squads or not versus Imperial or Chaos Knights, if they have to make a significantly longer charge, go around the ends of the ruins, and get that big base around there. Again, the Titanics get extra slow in their charge phase, given that they can't use their move over terrain rules in the charge phase when they're charging. At least ideally it does mean that for a lot of armies they should hopefully be getting the first strike on knights as opposed to the other way around, and if lists go very heavy on the Titanic knight chassis, that's probably going to be a bit more possible than otherwise. They're not going to have too many models, so those models will have to be going out to fight for the mid-board objectives, otherwise they lose on primary. So maybe in an ideal world you could have a cheap unit taking a mid-board objective, the enemy has to move up and take that point with a Titanic knight, destroying something that you don't care too much about, and then hopefully putting it in range of a big counter-attack from some primary damage dealers from you. Hopefully it wouldn't be too hard to have some units hidden in some ruins, safe from enemy shooting. The Titanic knight moves up, and then you jump on that, maybe with some shooting support to try and destroy it, which could at least get the damage off on the right foot. If the knight armies do have some armigers and war dogs, it could make things harder though. Pushing them out to the mid-board objectives might mean that you need to commit some force to destroy them and take those objectives, otherwise they're going to start racking up primary even faster, and you might have to think quite hard as to what of your mid-tier threats could handle those profiles or out-OC them. Ideally without you having to do the same, maybe using your big primary damage dealer to charge and destroy a war dog on an objective, and then have the rest of the Chaos Knight army go to town on you. When it comes to actually destroying knights, obviously the simple answer is just take a bunch of anti-tank. I feel like maybe more than most armies, there's a bit more element of list tailoring that you can do if there's a good chance you're playing knights. I feel like in more casual games, just going all out and list tailoring just to specifically build an army that utterly destroys the opponent's one isn't always the best form. It depends how you and your opponent interact. In general though, I feel like for the majority of people, if you're deciding to bring knights to a game, it's usually worth checking with your opponent to make sure they've at least got enough anti-tank to make it a game. And particularly with knights having as much raw power as they do at the moment, it would seem fairly reasonable to have at least a fair amount of it in an army. Just in general though, if you're going into tournaments and expecting lots of big tough knights around, then it's pretty reasonable to take more anti-tank there. Probably not so much that you can't handle other things, but certainly might make you think twice to make sure that your primary damage dealers are going to be effective into the common knight profiles. The sort of things that you're likely to run into are really quite predictable. For the vast majority of the popular Titanic knights at the moment, they tend to be toughness 11 with a lot of wounds, a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save against range only, though different armies and detachments will have other ways to make them tougher. If you do want to make sure that the army is well prepared for big knights, then strength 12 is a pretty obvious breakpoint. If you've got efficient damage dealers in your army that are strength 12, then it certainly makes sense to include a good number of them. Though obviously if your units aren't particularly efficient but are strength 12, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're onto a winner there. Otherwise there's plenty of other big hitting anti-tank weapons, strengths far higher, or things like mass mid-strength things with lethal hits and lance and stuff. Melee often tends to be one of the more reliable options to take down knights, given that they don't get their invulnerable save there, and have no option for rotate iron shields or diabolic bulwark. If you've got AP 3 or better against them there, then that's generally going to be a good time. For fighting armigers and war dogs, both strength 5 and strength 10 are really quite efficient into them compared with how they were before. It means that if it's a mixed knights list, then they're not going to be wasted, though those profiles are going to be far less efficient against the big boys. If you've got units and anti-tank in your army list, it's probably worth just being super sure of what your units can do and how things look if they swing a bit high or a bit low. If you've got a bunch of big guns, then you can literally just roll out a few shooting phases. Say for example you've got a big knight chassis out in the open, How many wounds do you average off it if you fire, say, your 3 biggest gun tanks at it? Or say you could look at one of your melee combo units. If you manage to get the charge on them at full strength and use a stratagem to help you out, how many wounds could you typically expect to deal to that knight? As it could make a big difference as to whether or not you throw that unit into that knight, or maybe you need to soften it up with a bit of shooting or give them some further support. Or bear in mind that with theoretical numbers though, the Chaos Knights might have -1 to hit at range, at least greater than 18 inches away. The Imperials might have Feel No Pain and rotate iron shields, and there's some tougher versions of knights, say like the Sevastus Knight Lancer. That 4+ invulnerable save in melee can mean that's a problem to take out there. Having a good idea of what your units are going to do, and whether or not they're likely to outright kill the knight or fall short by a good margin is perhaps handy enough though to know in advance if you are playing knights or think that you're going to a tournament where you're going to run into them. For objective scoring things, with the sheer damage defense and raw power of them, knights might often be an army that want to push forward and try and table you. But depending on their exact army and support, they still might be able to score well, generally tending to have a good time on primary objectives, and they likely won't be useless on secondaries, but maybe have a slightly harder time than some armies unless they're going heavy on the war dogs or the allies. One big game decision that you could make is to decide to go fixed objectives, maybe taking the combination of assassination and bring it down if you say squaring off against 5 enemy Titanic Knights. All the Titanic Knights are characters, so that means that if you slew 2 big knights, you'd be 20 victory points on the secondary objectives for the game. Slaying 3 would be up to 30, and if you slay 4, it'd be up to 36 victory points due to the caps on the bring it down secondary objective. It also means that you might fall behind in score earlier on in the game, and maybe pick up a few more challenger cards which could be used for more victory points, or some powerful stratagems potentially. Basically the decision feels like it depends on whether or not you think you could actually get those kills over the course of the game. I feel like if the opponent's only got, say, 3 big knights on the other side of the table, it might well just be a bit of a trap versus scoring secondaries regularly. It feels maybe like a gamble that you're going to kill at least 3 of the Titanic Knights over the course of the game for it to be an overall good decision. And if you wound up just getting 20 VP by destroying 2, it was probably a bad idea. If you did go for it though, it means that all of your focus could be on destroying the knights, stopping them scoring and fighting for the primary objectives, which could make the army's goals a bit simpler. I feel like it seems pretty reasonable if you're playing against the 5 knight list, or maybe even 6 knights if it's absolutely maxed out Chaos Knights, where if you can't manage to destroy 3 of them over the course of a game, then there's a good chance you might well have lost anyway. Otherwise, if trying to outwit and beat an army in Warhammer 40k, just having a good idea as to the enemy's profiles, what they do, and the likely knights that you might run into, and potential gotchas, or those could help out if you know roughly what they do. Obviously that's an enormous subject, probably best off by taking a look at the knights rules from their codexes, though I'll try and do just a very brief rundown of general vibes here. The armigers and war dogs tend to be expendable at around about 140 points or so. They have 14 wounds at toughness 9 and at OC 6, but they degrade to OC 3 if they're down to their bracketed level. That could occasionally be a big deal for trying to swipe some primaries off them. For the Chaos ones, you're probably likely to run into Carnivores with their fast movement and really big scary damage stats. Pretty excellent trading units for the mid-board, or maybe Stalkers that have a mixed threat and the Scout keyword. For the Imperials, it'll be the Warglaves and Helverins. They have their very punchy 18-inch range melter with big rerolls. Potentially, if you've got some big tanks and vehicles, you might be able to outrange them at a critical turn if it only makes the difference of a few inches movement, or at least try and be outside of their maximum melter range. The Helverins spam out a whole bunch of Strength 9 and AP 1 Damage 3 with Anti-Fly 2+. If there's absolutely loads of those on the board, then trying to make sure that your units have got cover saves is a pretty great idea. They can still focus down one target pretty hard with Squire's Duty though. Then for the standard Titanic Knights, they're 26 wounds, toughness 11, with a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, and they usually move 10 inches with that smash through terrain style rule. The Sevastus Knights having 28 wounds and moving 2 inches faster. The Castellans and Tyrants have enormous great big guns. They cost a bit more but are also far tougher than most, with a big T12 and 28 wounds. For their supporting rules, the Imperial Knights just get a whole bunch of raw might as their army rule. A 6+ Feel No Pain means they're harder to kill than average, and they get to reroll a single hit and wound roll whenever they shoot or fight, so particularly nice for big anti-vehicle style attacks. If you're focusing down one of them at range with some high AP weapons, they're likely going to rotate ion shields for a 4+ invulnerable save, and that can give you some issues with target priority, particularly if done, say, halfway through your shooting phase once you've already committed a bunch of damage into one knight. When playing against them, I'd certainly bear in mind that they really want to slay your Warlord if possible. If they do that, then they gain command points and a 5+ Feel No Pain for doing so, which is a pretty spectacular reward. So if you can possibly keep your Warlord safe until really late in the game, it's probably a good idea. I will bear in mind one common misplay, which is that you only get those rewards at the start of the Imperial Knight player's next command phase. so it won't be that their knights immediately gain that feel no pain for when you strike them back in the next turn. They'll have to wait for that reward. I certainly got that one wrong myself in early 10th edition. Otherwise, for another couple of surprise moves, bear in mind any knight that's got the Mysterious Guardian is potentially going to be warping around the boards to gain line of sight wherever it wants to, basically returning to reserves at the end of the enemy fight phase, and then deep striking somewhere else, so they're basically guaranteed enough to get the alpha strike on one enemy unit at least one time per game. It means that you might need to think about screening a bit more against that knight, at least compared with most army lists. You also have a 2 command point fights on death as well, and again that's not one to get caught out by, particularly with big knight melee stats, and knight chassis are going to be a particularly good one to use the 2 command point interrupt stratagem in, so certainly be wary if they have 2 command points left, or one with Canis, and you're charging multiple things. For their most common knight chassis, they seem to be playing in strong lists at the moment. Canis Rex is almost certainly going to be there. He's just undercosted at the moment. Vast amounts of damage both at range and in melee, and he's the one with the discounted stratagems, and there's loads of good options for him to use that on between the actual knightly stratagems such as rotate ion shields or free tank shock and things like that. We already mentioned the Warglaves and Helverins. The Knight Atropos is fairly general purpose, though excels in taking down vehicles and enemy Titanics. That one's got a 5+ invulnerable save in melee to watch out for, and the Knight Lancer will charge in and take a whole bunch of damage with its 4+ invulnerable, and it operates quite well as a sort of distraction Carnifex style knight. I certainly wouldn't underestimate its charge range as well with a 14-inch move and ability to smash through terrain. Then for shooting knights, both the Crusader and Castellan can be seriously scary. Big hitting damage profiles, and the Castellan really enjoys the rerolls on its Volcano lance. That's going to have a pretty reasonable chance to one-shot most normal-sized vehicles, particularly with command point rerolls thrown in, and maybe Mysterious Guardian to get line of sight on its key targets. I would say that if you see Castellans or Tyrants in the enemy army, one thing they're absolutely going to hate is to be tagged and locked up in melee. They only have 4 attacks at Strength 8, AP 1 and Damage 2 when they're in close combat, so they're not likely to do anything very significant there. And then when it gets to the Imperial Knights player's turn, they've got some difficult decisions to make. Do they fall back and have other units take care of the thing that tags them? Or do they stand and shoot and remain in melee with whatever engaged them? And then they'll be shooting at -1 to hit, and they won't be able to move before shooting, so if they wanted line of sight on something important, they might not be able to get it. They can't clear out the enemy that they're engaged with their own guns, as most of them have the blast keyword, so they can't fire directly into their own melee. Basically, if you have some of these stomping around, so just bear in mind how little the Knights player wants them to be engaged in close combat. For the Chaos Knights, they've got a few more options open to them, given they've got 4 detachments in a codex, most of which are really quite playable. Their core dread ability can make your leadership a bit worse, and maybe one of the most reliable benefits is a -1 to hit at greater than 18-inch range. It can mean that if you're on the borderline of that, it might make sense just to nose just within it, presuming they take it of course. Otherwise, they'll gradually have more battle shock rules over the course of the game, maybe rolling randomly for it in early turns, and you might find some of your better units debuffed with battle shock, particularly coming out of Knight Abominants. For their detachments, the Lords of Dread seems to be the standout one for them now. I really make sure that you bear in mind the enhancements that they've been given. There's some really big game-changing ones. Advance and Charge with the Throne of Blood. A Fights First with the Blade of Celerity that will make that knight incredibly hard to take out in close combat. And a Return to Reserve one in the same style as Mysterious Guardian with Warpborn Stalker. Just well worth that you remember what they do and remember which knights have them so they don't catch you out. Otherwise, they've also got that very powerful sticky objective rules, doing it for free at the start of any phase, which is big, and then having a base OC5 to defend it, so if you are trying to take an objective off them, you need to have at least an OC6 unit, otherwise don't go trying to flip their objective marker that they've moved off. They do have some powerful stratagems as well, one for -1 damage, and a big rerolls against monsters, vehicles and Titanics. Otherwise, Infernal Lance seems like the next most scary to me. That'll amp up knights with boosted damage defense or speed each turn. I've got good defensive stratagems with Diabolic Bulwark and an Armor of Contempt equivalent in melee. For some typical Chaos Knight chassis that you might see, the Abominant is big, cheap and general purpose and strides towards the mid-board, being best at killing infantry, not quite so stand out against really tough stuff. The Despoiler might often be seen by dual Gatling cannons, absolutely murderous against 2 wound infantry, and if you possibly can, don't give it ideal targets just to obliterate with those. It can still be scary enough against tougher stuff though, particularly with the anti-Titanic or the Infernal Lethals. The Knight Rampager just has obscene amounts of melee damage. If it gets into melee with something, there's a good chance it's just going to outright kill it. So if you have those pressing the front lines, it's going to pay to make sure that they're screened out of being able to charge the single most important units in your army, and hopefully have to clatter against some chaff and then get hit back. Maybe the same going for the Knight Lancer, but with a little bit more speed and more defense and less sheer power in terms of melee. The Knight Atropos is also good. We already mentioned the War Dogs earlier, and some of the most likely units that they might have for allied Chaos Demons might be Nurglings for a bit of infiltrate screening presence, or Beasts of Nurgle for some chaff objective units. Hopefully between taking a few good profiles, playing an intelligent objective game, not falling too foul of the crafty tricks too badly for the enemy knights, armies can still have some success, or would probably bear in mind that knights might well be a problem that can rapidly fix itself though if Games Workshop decides to do balance adjustments for them. And as ever in Warhammer 40k, probably not worth getting too worked up about any one army dominating for a short period of time, particularly if they wind up getting slapped down by a Rata sometime soon. I just can't really see Games Workshop continuing to let them enjoy this level of power trip for quite so long. I'm not sure if they'll get an emergency balance pass. It's even possible that by the time this goes out for most people, they'll already have got one. Or even if not with that, then it's probably going to be just a couple of months until their next major one. In the meantime as well, it's a more casual setting. If you really are just being repeatedly stomped into the ground by knights, it might well be worth discussing list power with an opponent and making sure the game's fun for both people. I probably wouldn't do the knee-jerk internet reaction of just declaring that you're never playing knights until you've at least had the experience and had a go at beating them. As mentioned, still looks like they're losing around about 4 out of 10 games or so. While it might be an uphill struggle, plenty of factions can still beat them pretty well. It just feels a bit weak to me to just surrender to the rumour of an armour being strong, when in reality you might not be facing against an optimal list or someone playing it particularly well. And there certainly might be some more obvious things that you can do against them. If you already have played the new incarnation of Knights several times over though, and generally not had a chance in those games, it could just be worth talking about the sort of games that you want with an opponent, maybe asking them to either tone down a list in some way, or give every chance of actually having a more even fight. There are certainly less optimal Knight lists that you could be playing with, maybe taking some of the lesser favoured variants of one sort or another, or even playing with a slight points handicap if the Knight player also agrees that arm is a bit OP at the moment. Definitely multiple ways to even the score a bit at casual games, with players doing just a little bit of their own balance adjustments. It does totally depend on the sort of game that you're having with the opponent though, and the general attitude to that sort of thing in your own playgroup. Let me know your thoughts though, including any other tips or tactics for laying low the super heavy walkers of Warhammer 40k. I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.